Hello, I'm Lisa Burkhart Worley, and welcome to Pop Talk, the show where you never know what topics might pop up. About 1 in 5 people struggle with mental illness. That means probably there's a mentally ill person in your family. I know that was the case in my family with a mentally ill mother. Well, today we're going to talk to a woman who also had a mentally ill mother, and she's going to share how she overcame shame and loss to actually love her mom's soul and mind. But before we introduce her, I want to introduce our Pop Talk co-host. On my far right is Dr. Lynette Sim.
Hello.
And to my immediate right is Rosemary LeGrand.
Hello, everyone.
Well, it is my pleasure to introduce our guest. Her name is Cecile Bibawi. She's the author of Loving Her Mind, Piecing Together the Shards of Hope. Cecile came all the way from Columbus, Ohio to be with us today, so we're so just grateful for that. She's a teacher and a speaker, and she was a public relations practitioner for Faith Mission Homeless Shelters in Columbus, Ohio. And as we said, she lives in Columbus with her husband and her 4 children, so she's a busy lady. Cecile, as you know, your story is very close to home. You had a mentally ill mom, and it was different growing up. But for a long time, you didn't realize that what she was saying and doing was actually as a result of mental illness, right? It just seemed that was your normal, right? And so you started noticing some things when you were a little girl. Can you just talk about that?
Yes. I grew up believing that people were watching us. And I thought this was normal. Growing up with an untreated mentally ill mother throws you into the vortex of her mental illness with her. And this is paranoid schizophrenia.
I got to meet you last night, and over dinner you were sharing a lot of little tidbits about your mom, and some of the things that you were saying was the statements that she made, you actually trusted her, obviously, so then you believed them.
Yes.
Can you give us some examples of some of those statements she made, and then how did that make you feel?
Yeah. So my mother used to tell us that we were being watched 24/7. And the people that were watching us were a committee of psychiatrists from the university in town, and they were also called psychopaths. And the reason they were watching us was because we were under mind control, meaning not just her, but us too. Another thing she said was that she's a psychic and that she could see evil. And she used to say that repeatedly, that she could see evil. I guess another thing I want to share is that she, every time I would want to befriend somebody, a friend would come over to play, even just as a little girl, or just anybody would enter our lives and want to get close to us. Usually what would happen is that they would enter her delusions, and she would say, no, that you are not allowed to hang out with them ever again because they're psychopaths and they're not really your friend. They're just using you to get to me.
Yeah, Cecile, my mom was very sedentary. It sounds like, though, your mom was active, right? Didn't she take you to school? She did some normal mom things?
She did. She was able to. We had dinner on the table every night. She took me to my soccer games, practices and games and things like that. She really had a routine. And my dad really ensured that routine was very, that was very followed very strictly. So.
And in spite of her illness, she was able to function properly with you all guys, your mom.
She was able to function physically. Physically, she was healthy. She was able to do things like, she took care of herself. She's very well, actually. She didn't have, socially, no. Socially, we were very isolated, and she didn't have any friends, if that's what you mean.
And even though it seemed a little weird, but you did not label this mental illness as a child when you were a child, but it affected the way that you related to your peers, right?
Yes, very much so. I was very shy. awkward, low self-esteem, low confidence. I didn't trust anyone. I learned not to trust, especially friends. I learned very quickly not to trust friends. Also, there was no support. Nobody ever came to my house and sat me down and explained what was going on. What is this that's happening? Nobody ever said the word mental illness. In fact, mental illness was unspoken and secret. I was frozen. I was speakless.
And nobody wants to talk about it. I know that's the way it was with my family, and later we did. But back in those days when we were growing up, it was just try to get over, try to do it, try to function. It's just like we would function abnormally. But there was one story I just want you to tell that was in your book. I read about this one friend you loved. There was a friend that you really liked a lot. But because of some things your mom said and did, you broke the friendship off, didn't you?
Yes. That was actually, I was only in 8th grade when that happened. And I believe I call her Sheila in the book. And she would have been my first best friend. So I just remember being so excited to have a friend who actually was allowed to come over and spend the night at our house. And I was just so excited, and we did. She came over for a sleepover, and we sat up all night and talked about things, and just like girlish things, like who our crushes were and things like that. And I was so happy. I just remember being so happy. And then she left the next day, and I remember just kind of buzzing about it with my mom and just telling her all about Sheila. And she said, "You can never see her again." And, I was shocked. Like, what do you mean I can never see her again? She's my best friend. Like, we told each other we were going to be best friends. And she said, "I'm sorry, honey, but she's a psychopath. And she is just using you to get to me." And she actually said those words. And she said, "You may never speak to her again." And being only 13, what I remember thinking was, I have to protect my mother from these psychopaths. And even though she doesn't seem like a bad person, I guess she is, and I have to do what she tells me to do. So I told her, I went to school the next day and told her, we can't be friends anymore, we're done. And I think I was even mean to her.
Wow, and we don't know how to handle our emotions when we're that age, right? We just cut it off. Yeah, so it's the difference between, it sounds like your mom and my mom, is that I kind of knew something was wrong. She would never go out of the house, and she wouldn't leave her chair. And I remember at one point very clear when I was like 8 years old, I took my dolls and I put them away. I made a conscious effort to put them away and say, I've got to be an adult now. I felt like I needed to be the adult in the house because my mom wasn't taking, management of the home and control. And so, that was a very hard thing. And it was hard for your dad too. Your dad worked a lot, and I think maybe his escape was to be out of the house a lot working. And so at some point, I guess she pushed him out of the house, right? I mean, how devastating was that to not have your dad there anymore?
For sure. Our view of my dad was very tainted. I mean, this is such an illustration of how mental illness, when somebody is mentally ill, the whole household becomes a part of that mental illness or of that world that she's living in. My father was seen by my mother as being unsupportive because she wouldn't call the neighbor and have him arrested for looking at her the wrong way, or for not cutting off his friends. He did have friends, and they would enter his delusions. She would be threatened or whatever, and she would say no more, and so they couldn't come to the house. And he honored her requests to a point, but obviously he didn't call the police on the neighbor when the neighbor looked at her the wrong way. So when he didn't, she deemed him as an unsupportive husband, and he can no longer live there. And she tried for years, wouldn't leave at first, and he tried for years and years, and finally he left. And that meant that us three children were with her alone. And so, of course, that was very, very difficult for us.
But at some point, you ended up moving in with your dad, and so you had this brief period of peace, and your siblings joined you, but your mom still tried to be part of your life. So how did that dynamic happen?
Yes, I have asked this question 1,000 times. How can someone with a severe mental illness, somebody like my mother who was so entrapped in her own world, even begin to hope to be a part of our lives, our world? It's just impossible. It's an impossible thing. And remember, she's still untreated at this point. So for sure, her mind was imprisoned in a type of hell, and she can't get out. And she was very, almost like dying to just have the one thing that she wanted in life, which is to have you know what it is, right? To have to enjoy her family and have a normal life, and she couldn't have that.
Yeah, I think one of the things we have to remember with mentally ill people, and I don't know who's watching right now who might have a situation in their own home, is that they cannot do what we do. We can't expect them to think the same way, can't expect them to do the same things. I know my grandmother used to be so frustrated with my own mother because, why don't you do this or why don't you go there? And she just couldn't because her brain chemistry was off. And I want to say in her defense, she had witnessed my father drop dead right in front of her eyes when she was pregnant with me, and that I know that did something like PTSD and just kind of snapped her mind. So I later had a love for my mother because I can't imagine what that was like that day. Yeah. And so, but, how did your father, I just keep wondering about your dad, did he ever have a talk with you kids and say, mom's got some issues and this is what's going on? And, I know your dad kind of helped with her medication to make sure she stayed on her medication. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so, no, he never really spoke a lot about Mom in terms of mental illness or in terms of, hey, this is what's happening to her. Not when we were young. And then when I was 16, I finally started to figure out what was going on. Around 16 is when I did. And that was when I moved in with him for that last year. And then he sat me down and he said, by the way, the reason I never told you before is because you wouldn't have believed me. And he was right. I wouldn't have believed him because I believed everything my mother said. And I didn't have any reason not to because it didn't sound strange to me at the beginning. So there was another part of your question.
Oh, I don't know. That's probably answers what, I just wanted to know about your father's involvement in it.
Yeah.
So it sounded like he didn't really say much when y'all were growing up as kids.
No.
Just kind of hid it. But then when you got to be old enough, I guess in his mind, you were probably old enough to handle it.
Exactly. He knew that we wouldn't have been ready, we wouldn't have believed him, we wouldn't have understood. Maybe he thought we would never have been able to accept it. And then when he could see that I was starting to figure things out on my own, then he was very free. He was very willing to talk about it with me.
And let me just ask you another question. I'm sorry, these
Sure.
are things that come to my mind because
Sure.
I'm thinking about my own situation. But,
Yes.
how did that rock your world when you found out your mom's mind was not right?
Oh, that's such a good question. I will tell you in one word, bittersweet. Because I discovered I'm not being watched. I'm not being watched. I can take a shower and not feel like I'm being watched. And because I remember being in the shower thinking these men in white coats are watching me right now. So I was overjoyed about that. But then that dawning on me that my mother is mentally ill. She's sick. And she's probably always going to be mentally ill.
And there's a lot of shame in that, isn't there?
Oh, I feel like that is when shame cemented for me because it was already taboo, right? I mean, when something is stigmatized, then shame is attached to you. It stains you.
And I don't know about you. I'm sorry. I know there's a lot going on in my head right now. But did you ever worry about yourself? I mean, I know that one of the worries I had was that maybe I could go down that road. You're always worried about your own sanity.
Oh. No.
You never worried about that?
No.
Okay, that's good.
And I don't know why. I always worried about my younger sister. And those worries were realized. She did eventually have late onset, diagnosed with schizophrenia. I don't know how I knew that or why. I was in denial about it for a while. My dad might have said something, but I was never worried about myself. No, I don't know why.
So when you're at your dad's house, your brother's there, and she comes to get him. and there's threatening behavior. What happens?
That night, she was, that last final scream, so to speak. She finally walked those 4 miles from the house to the apartment where at the time me and my brother were living with my dad. My little brother would have been 10 at that time, and he had just moved in that last year with us. And she walked with my 11-year-old sister and came to the apartment in such a fit of rage and demanded my brother back. She wanted to have my brother back. And then one thing led to another, and she began to just show some violence. She started throwing things, and I don't remember everything, but I do remember that my dad called the police, because at that time, that was all the recourse you had, was call the police. But they were finally able to get her to the hospital for treatment and get her the treatment that she so desperately needed.
Wow. And your mother ended up on some psychotic medication called Hydol.
Yes.
Yeah, and then she became better. Yeah?
Yes. Yes.
And then you met your husband, George.
Yes.
Yeah, and then just before the wedding, just did not want your mom to be there. Was there a particular reason?
I was scared she was going to ruin the whole day. It's my wedding day, right? And we were inviting people that had entered her delusions a long time ago, like close friends, uncles, and we had just decided to set that boundary and to invite them to the wedding. And keep in mind, she was on the Haldol, so she was stable, but her delusions never left her head. In other words, her beliefs that were not in touch with reality were still there, but she wasn't enraged all the time. She wasn't, constantly screaming or isolating. She was much more functional. So I thought it would be okay, and it ended up being okay in that particular situation.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, my mom was on Haldol as well. They did find out later that was not necessarily a great drug for people to take, and
I
it can
heard that
cause
too.
some brain damage. And I'm not convinced it didn't, because my mom got progressively worse. She was also on something called Milorel and then later lithium. And so your mom eventually, I guess, she didn't go to the wedding and everything, but she eventually did have some episodes, didn't she? And how did that affect the family?
Well, she did go to the wedding, and it was fine.
Oh, she did go to the wedding.
She did end up going to my wedding.
Okay,
Yes.
that's good.
Yes, she actually remained stable, pretty stable to where we could function again as a family. As long as you stayed away from certain subjects, we stayed pretty stable until an event that happened that really was horrible for all of us, and that was my dad's death.
Right.
Okay, so when my dad died, 3 major things happened. Number one, the orange juice, I call it the OJ meds. He had been slipping the Haldol into her OJ for over 15 years. My mother has always been in denial until today. She's in complete denial. She does not accept that she has any thing wrong with her, and that she is not, she's completely not in touch with reality. So she has no insight, basically. So my dad, this was the solution that my dad had come up with. I really believe God provided this for him. He found a colorless, odorless version of Haldol, and he was slipping it in her. He got her somehow, I don't know how, he got her to drink her orange juice every day in a little tiny juice glass. You know those old-fashioned little juice glasses?
Right.
And she somehow agreed to do that. So he was the one doing that. He was the only one doing that. So when he died, there was nobody left, nobody around. We had moved out. So now she's starting to
become. Did it fall on one of the kids' shoulders? Or?
Untreated. Well, none of us were living at the house, so this drug she needed to get this in her system every day, every other day, and there was just nobody. I was living out of state, and my siblings were just living their own lives, and they weren't able to do it, or they didn't. I don't even remember why.
Well, she remained stable, you say in your book, for about 6 years
Yes.
after he passed. So at
Yes.
least okay
She was
enough.
okay. Yeah.
Right. But then some of the bad habits started to return. So how did the three of you come together to help her?
Well, the triggering thing, there was a trigger, and any stressful thing, and this was a major stress for her, and that is my brother got married. So when he got married, she started to really decline, and she kept getting worse and worse and worse. And she was getting worse in ways we weren't even aware yet. And when we finally realized what was going on, we started the process of becoming her guardian. My brother and I started the process of becoming her guardian, her court-appointed guardian, and that helped tremendously.
That's good.
Yeah.
And you found joy, in Zumba.
Yeah.
Yeah, we almost had to ask you to do a little skit for us.
Oh, I would join you. It's my favorite too.
Oh, let's do it. Let's have a class right here.
No, after.
Okay.
Can you explain how that dance really helped you?
Yes. So Zumba helped me physically, mentally, and socially as well. Physically, it's my favorite cardio. I lost weight right away when I started doing it. And the music is it takes you to so many exotic places all over the world, and it just really, gets you going. Mentally, it was a stress release. Every stress I was bringing to the floor, I would leave it there when I walked out. It was just such a wonderful, mental break and mental, beautiful thing. And then socially, you not only move together, but you sweat together and you laugh together, and there's just something that is so addictive about that. And yes, I admit I was addicted to Zumba.
Well, I think we need to exercise. I mean, the
Yes.
endorphins go. I know I'm always happier when I
Absolutely.
exercise, and so that's a really important thing to do.
Yes.
Let's go back to your mom for just a minute. I know for myself, after I rededicated my life to Christ, I did go back and face my mom. I had been a runner for many years, didn't want anything to do with my mentally ill mother, but God gave me this strength to go back and forgive her, and eventually to love my mother. Yeah. And we had a reconciliation at the end of her life. Can you talk about how you came back to forgive your mom, but also to love her mind, as your book talks about?
Yes. So 4 things come to my mind. The first one is that I asked God to help me forgive her. Mm-hmm. That was the first thing, and believed that He would. And that's really important, is to ask with trust, knowing that He will give you the desires of your heart. And the second thing is to face your past. So I didn't realize right away, except with the help of, until I got help in therapy, that I needed to know what I was forgiving her for. I wasn't fully aware of the negative impact that it had on me. So when I did become aware of that, it was only then that I realized how bitter and resentful I was. And so when I was able to go back, the therapist helped me go back to my young self, my child self, and forgive that person, forgive that young girl. Forgive her for what? For not being able to save the day, for not being able to have the power that was necessary to take care of things. Nor was it ever my job to do that. And that's why I'm here today. I mean, I stand here in full acceptance of my story, without guilt, without shame, and without denial.
And so that's where I would like to ask you to do something for our listeners.
Okay.
There's a lot of us out there that are dealing with a family member who has a mental illness. Mm-hmm. If you could talk to them as they are feeling that shame or helplessness, and maybe share a secret on how they can continue or start to forgive, to heal, to reduce the shame, and to love unconditionally that family member who's mentally ill through no fault of their own.
Yeah.
Well,
that's a secret I'm totally willing to share and be very open about. Besides going back to your past and facing your past, we need to shake the shame off of us. We also, one big thing that would really help everyone, I think, is to talk about it. Talk. Whether it's to a friend or whether it's to a professional, talk about your situation, whether you're struggling or whether a family member is struggling, don't keep it inside. The other thing another thing I would recommend is to understand the condition that they're experiencing or your condition. Understand the illness, educate yourself, read about it. There's so many resources. Tap into those resources, and don't be afraid of what you're going to find out. We're not afraid to learn about diabetes. We're not afraid to learn about cancer. Why should we be afraid to learn about mental illness? Even if it means that we are touched with it, that's okay, because there is hope. And that's the biggest thing that I want to end with, is that there is always, always hope.
And I think one of the things that I know I did is that I realized because of my mother, she created some good things in me. You know, there were positives that came out of it. I'm very strong. I had to be. I had to sink or swim in my life. And so I know that because of my mom's illness and the weakness there, that I had to stand strong on my own 2 feet and make it in this world. I had nobody to depend on. So, you know, I thank her for that. And I thank her for just some of the, you know, she was such a beautiful artist. You know, she played the piano and harp. And so I love music. And I know that I probably got that love of music from her. So there's so many things that when we have a mentally ill family member, we have to realize that they did do something positive in our lives, and we have to be grateful for that. And so thank you, Cecile, for being on the show, coming down from Ohio. We're about ready to have an ice storm here in Texas, and so
I might have brought it with me.
Yeah, so you brought the cold with you, but her book, Cecile's book, is called Loving Her Mind, Piecing Together the Shards of Hope. It made me cry, and so if you have a mentally ill loved one, you're going to want to read this, because it's just going to touch their hearts, I think. It touch your heart. So pick up the book, get it on Amazon. Can they find it on Amazon?
Absolutely.
And if you want to reach out to Cecile, your website is CecileBibawi.com. Let me spell it, CecileBibawy.com.
Yes. That's right.
And of course, we would love for you to reach us here at Pearls of Promise Ministries, and you can do that at info@pearlsofpromiseministries.com. We're also on Facebook, Twitter at Pop Talk Media, and Instagram at Pop_Ministries.
And thanks to all of our television and radio platforms, including Paula White's Life Network for Women, Overcomers TV, CTN Tallahassee, World Trumpet TV, and Christian Mix 106.
So that is Pop Talk for today. We're just ordinary girls
Who God is turning into pearls.
Have a great week.